Today, we're doing a bit of speculating on the future. We are going to try to identify what decks are worth crafting if you're on a budget. That means it'll go from this Meta Report 20 from Team Leviathan Gaming, into Meta Report 2021, which means that it will survive a bounce patch. Why is that important? Well, if you're building a deck, you might be tempted to go to Tier 1, see Vi, and just craft this, because this is right now the best deck in the game. However, it's a little too good. If you played on the ladder and you played against Vi, you realize there is no way it's left alone after the next bounce patch. Vi, it has a big target on his back, and he deserves it. If you craft this and dump a ton of scrap into it, all of a sudden, next bounce patch, your deck might be completely obsolete, which would be my bet on what's going to happen for Vi. So what decks should you build? Well, I'm going to start with ones you should and then move on to the ones you shouldn't and why. The ones you should, the first one worth crafting, is going to potentially be Lockdown. Now, Lockdown is definitely a beneficiary of Vi. Vi is really good. Being able to turn off Overwhelming Hunger with Lockdown is incredible. Now, the reason this might be worth crafting is not only is it good now, even after the bounce patch, a lot of the cards you see in Lockdown are good in pretty much every Nilfgaard deck. You have the obvious standouts of Roderick and Masquerade Ball, which survived the metas throughout all of 2020. And then a lot of newer staples, Usurper Officer, you have Coup. These cards, even the Cupbearer, has seen a lot of play. These cards are excellent and will be probably used in any Nilfgaard deck that comes after a bounce change. So I feel pretty confident in this. It would not surprise me, though, if the leader ability changed. Once Vi's gone, you might not have as much of a need for Lockdown. The second deck that I think will survive to the next one, and probably be a top tier contender, is Skellige Warriors. Skellige Warriors is really good, but fair. You can interact with it interacts with you, and that is good Gwent. I think it'll leave pretty much untouched because of that. Now, the downside to this deck is there aren't many staples that cross from Skellige deck to Skellige deck, right? So if I'm running Lippy, for example, you'll see the cards are pretty different from what I'm seeing in Warriors. But since I think this one will survive, this deck list will survive a bounce patch, well worth crafting. Probably will be a top tier after we eventually see the bounce patch that fixes Vi. Now, let's talk about which decks and factions I didn't include. First, Syndicate. Syndicate, to be frank, is kind of a dumpster fire. On the meta report, Passiflora is ranked really highly, but if you look at it, you're not seeing any new cards. Actually, this entire deck list was something you could build before Way of the Witcher. At the end of the day, Way of the Witcher definitely shortchanged Syndicate. So, because Syndicate ended up shortchanged, they're kind of behind. They're going to need some serious help to their newer cards if they want to be relevant at all, but I have a bad feeling it's going to be very similar to how Frost was in the prior expansion for monsters. Cute, but never good. So, don't do Syndicate. They're going to need an expansion to get back in the game. Next, why don't we talk about Northern Realms? Northern Realms is kind of like that B tier that's going to stay B tier. There's nothing obvious to buff between Shield Wall, Reverence, or Witchers. Though I do think Witchers is currently underrated. Nothing really to buff. Not really in a bad place. They could use a bit of help going up, but I don't think CG Project Red is going to spare them much time. I think they're going to be saying, all right, you know what? Northern Realms will be another tier 2 deck. Not overly relevant into the next meta, but still kind of hanging around. Because I don't think they'll get attention paid to them, not really going to be worth it, because something like Skellige Warriors, which will probably also not have attention paid to it, will just end up being a better deck. Moving on to Monsters. Monsters isn't worth it because the moment Vi takes a nerf, everything's up in the air. I don't really know what monster deck will come out, or if one will. There's Carapace, but this is, I think, right now slightly overrated. And depending on what cards get nerfed or buffed for monsters, it might be devastating. A 1-point provision increase to Haunt would be horrible. So, want to wait and see on monsters. Hard to predict their status in the Meta Report 2021. Basically, what comes after the next bounce patch. And last but not least, potentially the most exciting one to talk about is Scoia'tael. Scoia'tael has some highly ranked decks. You got Deadeye and Precision Strike Jezrus. Here's the problem. Scoia'tael has this engine. It's very dependent on this engine. There's really two of them. You got Sentry, Matron Cat Witcher, you also have Volunteers plus Novigradian Justice. These, in my eyes, are all on the chopping block. For Novigradian Justice plus Volunteers, 1 point are nerfed or Mahakam Volunteers, or 1 provision point increase could be devastating. Likewise, though, I think the real thing that's on the chopping block is going to be the move of Matron, Witcher, and Sentry, especially Sentry or Witcher. They feel just a touch too push and a touch too easy to slot into decks, and that's not good. You want variety. And CD Projekt Red knows that there can be some variety for Scoia'tael, because the spell Scoia'tael list, taking advantage of cards like Herald, is really cool and neat, and that's an excellent thing. It's not a good sign to see that Move Witchers is sneaking its way into something like an Elf deck. So as a result, it would not surprise me if Move got a little bit of a small tap, but it was enough to mess up their decks, forcing you to potentially pivot over something like Spell Scoia'tael. So big picture, wait on all the other factions that are in Skellige or Nilfgaard. Look to Skellige Warrior, look to Nilfgaard Lockdown for this current meta, and then those cards that were relevant in those decks will probably still be relevant in the next meta, after whenever the next bounce patch is. Now, one other note, if you look at these decks, Usurper Officer is critical for a Lockdown deck. It's one of their key finishers. Warriors, Herald is key. Herald is a warrior-driven card. If you were to go ahead and log on into Gwent and go over to the shop, you'll see a faction pack, and you can see that you can buy the Usurper Officer plus 5 Nilfgaard Kicks for $5. Same deal with Skellige, meaning one of the big legendaries that is a must-have for these decks is going to cost you $5 to get 5 Kicks, and even a Skellige border or a Nilfgaard build border, depending on which way you go. It is well worth $5 to do this. If you have it lying around, save yourself the time and get yourself the card you want. And that's my summary. Go build your Lockdown decks. Go build Skellige Warrior. Rock the ladder, and then when the next balance patch happens, you'll keep rocking the ladder. Make sure to subscribe down below, and I'll see you next time.